The Atlantic Ocean had a way of swallowing sounds. Waves crashed against the jagged cliffs with a thunder that echoed through the night, yet beyond that endless roar there was an eerie silence that unsettled anyone brave enough to stand near Blackstone Point. At the very edge of those cliffs stood an ancient lighthouse, its towering stone walls scarred by more than a century of storms. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, yet every midnight its lantern somehow burst into life, sending a pale beam across the sea. The strangest part was that no one had been inside the lighthouse for over 50 years. Local fishermen refused to sail near it after sunset. Pilots altered their routes to avoid flying overhead at night. Even tourists who came searching for ghost stories rarely stayed longer than a few minutes. Everyone in the nearby village knew the same warning, whispered from one generation to the next. Never follow the light. No one knew exactly who had first spoken those words, but everyone believed them. Ethan Carter had spent his career investigating forgotten places and mysterious legends. As a documentary filmmaker, he had traveled through abandoned castles, deserted hospitals, and ruined prisons. Most ghost stories turned out to be nothing more than old myths mixed with imagination. But Blackstone Lighthouse was different. The stories surrounding it refused to die. Some claimed they heard footsteps climbing the spiral staircase despite the building being empty. Others reported seeing the shadow of an old lighthouse keeper standing silently in the lantern room. A few even swore they heard desperate cries for help drifting across the ocean on calm nights. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in answers. With cameras packed into waterproof cases and enough supplies for 3 days, he drove toward the isolated coastline just before sunset. The narrow road twisted through dense forests where ancient pine trees blocked most of the fading sunlight. By the time he reached the tiny fishing village closest to the lighthouse, darkness had already begun covering the sea. The village looked frozen in time. Weathered wooden homes lined the empty streets. Fishing boats rocked gently in the harbor. A cold wind carried the smell of saltwater through the air. Only one building still had lights inside. A small cafe. When Ethan stepped inside, conversation stopped instantly. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. An elderly woman standing behind the counter quietly asked, "You're heading to the lighthouse, aren't you?" Ethan smiled politely. "How did you know?" She looked toward his camera equipment. "They always bring cameras." "They?" "The others." Ethan frowned. "What others?" Her face became pale. "The people who wanted proof." Silence filled the room. Finally an old fisherman spoke from a nearby table. "They never proved anything." "What happened to them?" Ethan asked. The fisherman stared into his untouched cup of coffee. "They disappeared." Another villager interrupted quickly. "Not all." Everyone looked toward him. He swallowed nervously. "One came back." Ethan leaned forward. "What did he say?" The man hesitated. He couldn't speak. "What do you mean?" He never spoke another word. The cafe became silent again. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant ocean. The elderly woman placed an old brass key onto the counter. "You'll need this." Ethan looked confused. "What is it?" "The lighthouse key." "I thought nobody had entered for decades." "We haven't." "Then why keep the key?" She answered without looking at him. "So someone can lock it again." Those words lingered in Ethan's mind long after he left the cafe. The drive to Blackstone Point took another 20 minutes. As his truck rounded the final bend, the lighthouse appeared against the darkening sky. It was enormous. Far taller than he had imagined. Its weathered stone walls rose from the cliffs like the remains of some forgotten fortress. Broken windows stared toward the ocean like empty eyes. Rusted railings surrounded the lantern room high above the crashing waves. The building should have looked dead. Instead, it felt like it was waiting. Ethan parked beside an abandoned keeper's cottage. Weeds covered the stone path leading to the lighthouse entrance. He checked his watch. 11:37 p.m. 23 minutes until midnight. Perfect. He mounted a camera facing the lighthouse and switched on another handheld recorder. If the legends are true, he whispered into the microphone, the lantern should activate at exactly midnight despite there being no electricity. The wind suddenly stopped. Complete silence surrounded him. Even the crashing waves seemed strangely distant. His camera battery flickered unexpectedly. Full charge. Then half. Then full again. Static filled his headphones. A faint voice emerged. Help. Ethan froze. He removed the headphones. Nothing. Only silence. The digital clock on his camera changed. 11:59. Without warning. The lighthouse lantern exploded into life. A brilliant white beam sliced across the ocean. Every light in the village far behind him went dark at the exact same moment. His cameras began recording automatically. Inside the lighthouse. Something moved. Not a shadow. A figure. Someone was slowly climbing the spiral staircase toward the lantern room. Ethan zoomed in. The figure wore an old lighthouse keeper's coat soaked with seawater. Its face remained hidden beneath the wide collar. Step. 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 It climbed higher. Reaching the lantern room, it stopped before the giant glass windows. Then. It slowly turned toward Ethan. Even from hundreds of feet away, he could feel its eyes staring directly into him. His camera screen suddenly filled with static. When the picture returned, the figure had vanished. Heart pounding, Ethan forced himself toward the massive wooden door. His hands trembled as he inserted the old brass key. The lock clicked. The heavy door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty tower. Cold air rushed from the darkness inside. It smelled of salt, rust. And something else. Something old. Something that had been trapped for decades. Ethan switched on his flashlight. The narrow spiral staircase disappeared into darkness above. Then. A single wet footprint appeared on the dusty stone floor. Another. Another. They were fresh. And they were leading upward. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight and took a slow step inside, unaware that the ancient lighthouse had been waiting many years for someone willing to climb those stairs. If you're enjoying this chilling journey into forgotten places and terrifying legends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more mysterious stories waiting behind abandoned doors, if you dare to discover them. Ethan stood frozen inside the lighthouse, his flashlight fixed on the trail of wet footprints leading up the ancient spiral staircase. The air was unnaturally cold, and every breath formed a faint cloud before his face. Behind him, the heavy wooden door slammed shut with a deafening boom. He rushed back and grabbed the handle, but it refused to move. It was as if the lighthouse had locked him inside. Trying to stay calm, Ethan reminded himself there had to be a logical explanation. Old buildings shifted with the wind. Rusted locks jammed. Strange sounds echoed through empty towers. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the fresh footprints on a floor covered in decades of dust. Gathering his courage, he started climbing. Each step groaned beneath his boots. The circular staircase seemed endless, twisting higher into darkness. Old photographs hung crooked on the stone walls, their frames covered with cobwebs. Ethan paused to wipe dust from one of them. It showed a lighthouse keeper standing proudly beside his family, a smiling wife and a little girl holding a lantern. Written beneath the picture were the words. Keeper Samuel Graves, 1968. A strange feeling settled over Ethan. He remembered hearing that the lighthouse had closed in the late 1960s after a mysterious tragedy. According to local legends, the keeper had vanished during a violent storm, and his family had never been found. As Ethan continued upward, he noticed something impossible. The higher he climbed, the newer the footprints became. Water still dripped from them, forming tiny puddles on the stone steps. Then he heard it. A child's laughter. Soft. Gentle. Echoing from somewhere above. Ethan. He stopped instantly. The voice had spoken his name. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief second he saw the silhouette of a little girl standing at the top of the staircase. She wore an old-fashioned white dress and held a glowing lantern. Before he could call out, she turned the corner and disappeared. Heart racing, Ethan followed. He reached the lantern room at exactly 12:17 a.m. The giant light rotated silently, casting its pale beam across the endless ocean. There was no electrical wiring connected to it. No fuel. No machinery. Yet it continued shining as though powered by something beyond explanation. Standing beside the lantern was the same figure he had seen from outside. The lighthouse keeper. His coat dripped seawater onto the wooden floor. His gray beard swayed gently despite the still air. Slowly, he turned toward Ethan. His face wasn't terrifying. It was filled with sadness. "You came," the old man whispered. Ethan struggled to speak. Who are you?" "I am Samuel Graves. The lighthouse keeper." Samuel nodded. "I never left." Before Ethan could ask another question, the room around him began to change. The broken windows became whole again. The peeling paint disappeared. The old lighthouse transformed into the way it had looked decades earlier. Outside, a violent storm raged across the sea. Thunder shook the tower as enormous waves crashed against the cliffs. Ethan realized he wasn't seeing a ghost. He was witnessing the past. Samuel looked toward the raging ocean. They were coming home. Far below, a small fishing boat fought desperately against the towering waves. Inside the boat were Samuel's wife and daughter. "They were only minutes away," he said quietly. "I kept the light burning." The storm grew stronger. Lightning struck nearby, shaking the lighthouse. Then Ethan saw another bolt crash directly into the lantern. Glass shattered. The great light went dark. Without its guiding beam, the fishing boat disappeared into the darkness. A terrible crash echoed through the night. Samuel closed his eyes. "I failed them." The vision dissolved. The lantern room returned to its abandoned state. Samuel stood silently before Ethan. "For 58 years, he whispered, I have kept the light burning. Hoping they would find their way home." Ethan's eyes filled with emotion. "It wasn't your fault." Samuel smiled sadly. "I know." He looked toward the sea one final time. "But I could never forgive myself." Suddenly, the little girl Ethan had seen earlier appeared beside Samuel. She gently took his hand. A woman dressed in a rain-soaked coat stepped from the shadows and smiled warmly at him. Samuel stared at them in disbelief. "You waited for me." His wife nodded. "We've always been here." The room filled with a soft golden light. For the first time, Samuel's tired face showed peace instead of sorrow. The three figures slowly walked toward the glowing light together. Before disappearing completely, Samuel turned back toward Ethan. "Tell them the truth." Then they were gone. The lighthouse lantern stopped rotating. Its brilliant beam faded. Darkness settled over Blackstone Point. The haunting silence was finally broken. Morning sunlight streamed through the cracked windows as Ethan slowly descended the staircase. The wet footprints had vanished. The photographs remained old and faded. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Outside, villagers were already gathering near the lighthouse. The elderly woman from the cafe approached him. "You saw him?" Ethan nodded quietly. She looked toward the now dark lantern. The light is gone. Yes. Tears formed in her eyes. Then he's finally at peace. Weeks later, Ethan released his documentary. He didn't exaggerate what he had experienced. He simply told the story of Samuel Graves, the lonely lighthouse keeper who had spent decades guarding a light for the family he believed he had failed. Millions watched. Some believed every word. Others called it fiction. But one strange detail remained impossible to explain. On every copy of the documentary, just before the final scene ended, a faint figure could be seen standing in the lantern room for a single frame. Experts examined the footage countless times. No one could explain it. Today, Blackstone Lighthouse still stands on the lonely cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Visitors say the lantern has never shone again. Yet on certain foggy nights, people claim they hear distant laughter carried across the waves, a little girl laughing, no longer frightened, but finally going home. And if you ever find yourself standing before an abandoned lighthouse where a lonely light suddenly appears after midnight, remember the old warning whispered by generations before you. Not every light is meant to be followed. Some are simply saying goodbye. If you enjoyed this mysterious journey and want more haunting stories about forgotten places, cursed buildings, and unsolved legends from around the world, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, and never ignore the whispers of the past.